So as we mentioned before I hit record, my name's Kimberly and I'm one of the librarians who works with instruction, but I also do a fair amount of work with writing literature reviews and systematic reviews, which is why we're doing this presentation. And then Christy is here as well from the campus writing program, and her expertise is in all things writing. So hopefully we'll be able to merge those two with the research and the writing components and help you demystify the literature review, as the title here says. So we're going to jump right in. And Christy, do you want to introduce this particular slide and activity?
Absolutely. So at the campus writing program and in writing intensive courses in general, we realize that writing is generative. And so the best way for all of us to come into the same space and to think about the same topic is through a quick piece of writing. We also know that the number one enemy to writing, especially at the graduate and in the academic world, is the blank page, right? So any way we can get over the blank page syndrome, the more productive we are, which is especially important for literature reviews. So here's what we would like you to do. Pull up that chat box again, and we're going to type, we're just going to do a focused free write for 2 minutes, and I'll explain what that is here in a second, but we're not going to hit enter yet. Okay, so you're gonna generate your response to one of these questions in the chat, and then I'll count down from 3, 2, 1, and then we'll all hit enter at the same time so we can see everyone's words at once and we're not interrupted by it. Okay, so here are the 3 questions that we're interested in today. You might like to spend your 2 minutes writing about the purpose of a literature review. So what is the purpose of a literature review? Why do we do these terrible things, right? The second question might be useful to you, and that is, what components does it contain? So what is it made up of? And then finally, the last question is thinking about process. What do you do from start to finish in drafting a literature review? So a focused free write is exactly that. We don't care about spelling or grammar, usage. We are not looking at the quality of the writing. We're really just trying to access the knowledge that's in our minds and get it out into the world. And so we know kind of what we already know and what we want to focus on today. So pick one of those questions. I'm going to set a timer here for 2 minutes. Type it in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. Okay, go now. Keep going, keep typing for another minute, move on to another question if you run out of things to say. All right, if you'll finish your sentence, and then I'll count down. So I'll give you about 15 seconds to finish your sentence. And hit enter, and you're ready. 3, 2, 1, go. And now let's just take a second to look at these, just skim through them. I like some words I'm seeing in the chat here, and I'll ask Kimberly to highlight what she thinks is really interesting. I like the words that you're using here about consolidating. So looking across all of the work that's been done on a topic and consolidating in some way, that's super important. I like that people are focusing on selecting a topic, which I think is an interesting first step, and not just selecting it, but narrowing it, right? We can't do a literature review until we've narrowed our topic to something manageable. I see words like base of knowledge. I really like this language of critical engagement. I think that's our English department person. I have a master's in English, and that feels very familiar to me. This idea of not just pulling literature and using it at face value, but really critically engaging in it. I love what you all are bringing to the work here today. What did you notice, Kimberly?
I did like that many people mentioned filling the gaps. You can see where the gaps exist in the literature when you look at a literature review, and then see how your research might fit into that gap. Or if you don't know what area you want to research, if you're trying to identify a gap, literature reviews can help you do that. I noticed that most people chose that first question, which makes sense. It's the one on top. What is the purpose? But we did have a couple people talk about the process. And I thought that was interesting. There was one in particular that said they started with Google Scholar. And I think that works sometimes. And we're going to dig a little bit more into when that might work and when it might. So I really like, a lot of what's saying about noticing where the gaps are specifically.
And I just wanted to highlight the free write strategy one more time, in that we may come to this workshop like we don't know anything about literature review. That's why we're here, right? But as you can see, we have a wealth of knowledge to start from. So I like to use this skill both pedagogically in my classes, but also to get myself started writing on my own topics. So use it broadly, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you for engaging in the chat. That really helps us know where we're starting out with. And I want to expand a little bit into that, because when we talk about the phrase literature review, it often gets used in a multitude of different ways. In academia, we like to be really complicated. We use the same words to talk about many different things. And the term literature review is just one of those phrases that comes up all the time, but it doesn't always mean the same thing. So there are really three types of literature review. So if you're told to write a literature review for class, it might be one thing. If you're writing a literature review for publication, it might be something else. So the first kind of a literature review is just very simply article background. Most articles, most research articles have the same anatomy. They all start with an abstract, and then they all have that introduction background piece, which is sometimes called a literature review, before they get into the methodology and the results and all of that. So this background gives voice to the conversation that's happening around a particular topic, so that when you read the author's work, you understand how it fits into that larger discussion. None of our research exists in a void. So when we do research, we're building on studies and experiments that have already happened. So that first section, that article background, is called a literature review. This doesn't have to be comprehensive. Again, it's really just an introduction, so your reader understands the field a little bit more and understands how your research fits into that field. The second type of literature review, the entire article is a review. So it's not just a background section, it's the entirety of the publication. There's not new material generated. There's new analysis generated and new understanding generated, but you're not necessarily doing a survey or running an experiment. You're taking data that already exists and just pulling it together. One of the analogies that I hear really frequently about literature reviews is this idea that it's the forest for the trees metaphor. So many researchers look at that particular tree. They spend most of their field and most of their career narrowing on a really, really specific focus. But how do you see the bigger picture? And you can see it through a literature review that pulls together many, many of these individual pieces and tries to make sense of the field as a whole. So review article, the entire article is a review, and there's three kinds of those. We have our general literature review. This is just a generic, here's what's out there, make of it what you will type of a paper. Next up, we have the systematic review. This is a type of literature review, but it's very orderly, it's very concise. So a literature review is just like, make of it what you will. A systematic review is, I looked at all of these articles, here's what they mean, here's the understanding that we gain from it. So it's a very specific idea of literature review. It's much more formulaic, and it's much more, when I say formulaic, what I mean by that is that it has a really rigid structure of how you go about doing it, because like any good research, it needs to be recreatable. Another researcher should be able to come to this exact same project and get the exact same results. So systematic review, again, is result focused and tries to come up with an answer to what the field is saying. A meta-analysis is a type of systematic review. So again, here's the field and here's what it's saying, but it does so in terms of data and statistics. It's very number driven. You're going to see a lot of formulas, like actual mathematical formulas, in a meta-analysis that you might not see in a systematic review or a general literature review. So that's kind of the graph that you see off on the right side of the slide here. These are all review articles. You have your literature review, you have systematic reviews, which are a kind of literature review, but more specific. And then you have meta-analyses, which are type of systematic review, but again, more specific and very data-driven. These intentionally are comprehensive. So they try to look at the whole field. You want to make sure when you're doing a systematic review or a literature review that you're getting all of the articles and all of the material out there. So when you do come up with that conclusion, you can say, I did look at everything in this field. I'm not missing any pieces. So the review article is comprehensive. The third one is your dissertation background. So if you're a graduate student, you're kind of mushing, that's an academic word that we can use, mushing, number 1 and 2 together, because you're giving background for your original research, but you also need to be comprehensive so that you can prove that your research is original, that it hasn't been done before, there's nothing else out there like it, or if there is, you have a new take or a new spin, and there's something that hasn't been considered before. So these are really the 3 types of literature reviews that exist out there. They're pretty different. And so my next question is asking in the chat box, which of these 3 are you interested in? Do you want to learn about writing background? Do you want to learn about writing review articles? So those systematic review type materials, or are you interested in the dissertation piece? So go ahead and throw that into the chat, because I'd love to see where most of the individuals in the session are kind of hoping to learn. And you don't have to share that. This is just me trying to get a feel for where we're at as a group. And I don't know if while I'm sharing my slides, I could see the chat box before, but now it's not popping up for me.
I can help you out with that. It looks like right now we're kind of split between systematic review and dissertation as the most, but there are a few article comments in here as well. So it looks like both dissertation version and the systematic review could be really helpful.
Okay, great. So more the comprehensive side of things than the background side of things. That's good. So in terms of the comprehensive side of things, there are a couple pieces to that. And we're going to run a few of these and actually look at the library's website and do some of the research, and I'll stop doing quite as much lecturing. But as part of creating something that's reproducible, creating something that you can prove is comprehensive, there are multiple steps to keep track of. Because again, you want to have a methodology section where you can write up, here's what I did, and then another researcher can follow those steps and get the exact same results. So part of that is creating something called a search string. When you're running your search, you want to use the exact same terminology and the exact same structures and tricks and tips that are consistent everywhere you run the search. And this is important because, again, you want someone else to be able to take those exact same words and phrases and then be able to reproduce your search. This also means that you're looking in specific locations. So tools like Google Scholar are unique and individualized. They're based on previous searches that you've run before, and they're based on the resources that you have access to. The same thing is true when you look at the library's homepage, and we see people fall into this trap pretty consistently. Our library's homepage, many libraries often have a discovery layer on the front website that is really a conglomeration of different tools that the university has. So ours looks at about 30 different databases, it pulls stuff from the catalog, it's getting stuff from a little bit of everywhere, but it's a very specific to MU tool. It does not exist at other universities. Other researchers could not recreate that search. Again, it's kind of based on the algorithm of what you have access to and what you've looked for in the past. So instead, when you're creating a search string for a systematic review or a dissertation, you want to very clearly state where you're running that search. So not just the terms you're using, but where you're using them. For example, if you're looking at psychology, you might look into PsycInfo, which is a psychology database. You might look at Scopus or Science Direct, which are databases that lean a little bit more toward the sciences. You're going to look in specific databases rather than in an algorithmic search, if that makes sense. So those kind of fall hand in hand, that search string and reproducibility. Part of that reproducibility is also keeping track of your criteria. And we use something called inclusion and exclusion criteria. So your inclusion criteria, these are the things that you're trying to look for. And your exclusion criteria is usually the flip side of that coin, the things that you're not going to include. An example of this might be the date range. So if you decide I'm only looking at articles from the last 10 years, your inclusion criteria would be articles from 2010 to 2020. 2021 now technically, but we don't have a lot of 2021, so I would go back to 2010 for that example. Your exclusion criteria in this case then would be everything before 2010. This is really common for systematic reviews and for dissertations because you're trying to condense it to a manageable number. You don't want to have 1,000 articles to actually look through. You might wind up with 50 or 60, or maybe only 20, depending on how narrow your topic is. But you want to make sure, again, that you're keeping track of all of these reasons. Really common criteria that we see include the date range. It includes limiting to peer-reviewed sources sometimes. It often includes geographic location. So for example, I wrote one recently where we were looking at mental health interventions for incarcerated populations. And we're specifically looking at the prison system in the United States. So our inclusion criteria was the United States. Our exclusion criteria was any sort of information from another country. So keeping track of that is all really important as well. And then the last thing here that I'd like to plug is a citation management tool. If you have not started using one yet, I highly recommend them. Zotero and Mendeley are the two that are supported at the University of Missouri, and we will talk a little bit more about those later. But these keep track of your articles because when you're running these searches, you need to make sure, again, that it's reproducible. So you keep track of everything that you find. So if you come across 1,000 articles, you might only use 20 of them, but you need to explain why you didn't use the other 980. You need to say like, oh, well, we didn't use 70 of them because they were a different country. And we didn't use these 50 because, of the date range. So a citation management tool, you can export your entire search and all of the results at once, and then stick things into folders if you decide you're going to use them, or if you decide you're not going to use them, folders for why. And I'll show you an example of that later. Okay. The last thing I wanted to briefly touch on is the anatomy of a scholarly article. We mentioned that first section is often called an introduction or literature review or a background. That's true for a systematic review or a dissertation as well. You still have a background because you're still kind of explaining, here's what I'm doing, here's the field that I'm looking at, why it's of interest, and what I think we're going to learn or what we're hoping to gain from doing this analysis of all the literature that's out there. So you get that same introduction section. Your next section down is going to be your methodology, just like a normal article would say, oh, my methodology is we ran the survey and we had 72 participants. Now your methodology is going to be, oh, we have the search string. We looked in these databases. We found 200 articles, and here's why we're only using 10 of them. So methodology is still that next section, kind of the dry part, but important, again, to make that recreatable aspect a thing. Your next section is going to be your results. Here's what we found. And then, of course, the conclusion and discussion. So just to keep that in mind, I am going to close out of this slide and actually go to the library's homepage and give a couple examples of what I mean when I say a search string. So I am going to use this gray box just for an example purpose. Again, you would go into a particular database to be recreatable. If you're just looking for background material and you're not interested in being comprehensive, then the gray search box is a great tool. If you're trying to be comprehensive and do it database by database, that's going to be this link down here under the looking for. But again, I'm just running an example. So I'm going to go into our search box and hit enter because I'm lazy. And I like seeing the setup that the search has where it breaks things down and makes it easier for me. The first thing to note is that I am off campus. So I get this bar across the top that says, welcome guest, please log in for further access. You do want to do this. This is what recognizes you as a member of the MU community. So then you do have access to the articles that you find. I've already done it today, so it's not making me log in. This is just your paw print and password, though. It's the same thing you use for email, the same thing that you would use for MyZoo or MyHR. Now we've got multiple search boxes here, and some of this might be a refresher for you. You may be really familiar with creating search strings already, but the extra search boxes, you can have as many of these as you want, narrow your search down. So rather than just typing in like, oh, how does the pandemic affect college student stress, which you would find results for, you want to break it down to be comprehensive because one author might talk about college students and one author might talk about university students. So you need to include both terminologies. So for example, if I say I'm talking about the pandemic, I'm just going to use this as a timely example, and college and stress. I'm putting each of these topics on different lines. This and between forces an overlap. So now I'm saying like a Venn diagram, I have to have the overlap between these terms. I only want to see articles and materials that talk about all three of these points. The more of these you add, the fewer and fewer results you will get. So if you're trying to narrow down the number of results you have, adding more layers to your search is going to help. The next step is, again, expanding that out because some researchers might talk about the pandemic and some researchers might talk about COVID or coronavirus. You can see as soon as I typed in or, it started giving suggestions. These suggestions can be helpful. They're not always great. So keep that in mind. Knowing your field helps. Looking at background resources like Wikipedia or reference source is usually a good idea for this too. So you might say college or university or higher education or undergrad. And I'm going to stop there and show you a couple tricks here. An asterisk at the end of a word finds alternate endings. So if we do undergrad, we'll find undergrad, undergrads, undergraduate, and undergraduates. It's really frequently used for plurals, but it really can be used for any sort of alternate ending. So I might say university here gets an asterisk because then I get the plural of university. Same for colleges. Coming up to our previous example, I would say COVID with an asterisk because then we'll both get COVID by itself and also COVID-19. The other trick to know is anytime you have more than one word, you want to put it in quotation marks because this groups it as a phrase. We're looking for the phrase higher education. We're not looking for education off on its own because I'm not interested for this particular search maybe in K through 12 education. So the quotation marks force that to be a phrase. Then the last part we would say stress or anxiety. I'm going to put an asterisk there so we also get anxious, or depression, depressed, or we'll do psych. Psych is a favorite of mine, partially because I work with the psych department and partially, helps if you spell it correctly though, partially because it has so many alternate endings between psychology and psychopharmaceutical and all of those things. So now if we run a search, we're going to find a more comprehensive amount of materials. And I didn't, again, this is hopefully somewhat of a review for some of you. If you ran this search without all the synonyms, you would find much fewer results. Clearly, this is something that's being talked about an awful lot right now. There's a lot of research being done in this field, so we're going to find a ton of material. This would be a really, really large subset of data to work with to try and be comprehensive, but that's okay because you're not going to. We're going to narrow this down. You could narrow it down by adding another field here. You could specifically look at students, for example. This right now might be picking staff and faculty up as well. We're also feeling stress. But if you scroll down on the left side, you'll see a whole bar that lets you limit the search. And there are a couple here that are pretty traditional to use. Peer review is a common one. If you teach, you may have put this in an assignment. If you're a student, you may have seen this in an assignment that you're doing. So just checking that box gets rid of newspaper articles and everything else that's not peer reviewed. You also can limit by the date. This one's a little weird for the search that I picked because obviously the current pandemic is a very recent topic, so sliding our date bar over isn't going to change much. However, there have been previous pandemics and there may have been articles about those from different timelines as well. So I'm just interested in the current one, so I'm going to slide that over pretty far and look at more recent date range. And we've gone from over 200 to about 85, still too many. Whoop. My computer is bouncing around more than I would like. So let me go back to that. I did not mean to click on the article. Continue. Come back. Dear technology. Okay, here we go. I never know sometimes with my computer if it's going to cooperate or not. Okay, so the last way that's really traditional and common to narrow down a search is by limiting the field where these terms show up. Right now, they're being looked for anywhere in the article. They could be a main theme. You can see from my first few results, they're pretty on point. You're seeing them in the title. But a lot of the results, this just might be a word in the middle of the article. The further you get down into your results, the fewer that are going to be relevant. So you can force these to show up in really specific fields. Traditionally, the title field, subject field, and abstract field are going to be the most commonly used to limit. I'm going to do title for now. It's pretty specific, so you wouldn't be as comprehensive doing a title search as you would a subject or abstract search. As long as you put that in your methodology, though, you can still get away with it. Because again, the goal is to make it reproducible. Now I only have 358. This is a very reasonable number to work with and to go through. Obviously, not all of them are going to be ones that I use. And some of them are duplicates. Those first two, for example, are duplicates. Because again, this search isn't a recreatable one. It's pulling stuff from everywhere. We've got Science Direct and Scopus as the first two results, but it's the same article. Okay. Couple things to note, if you are doing a comprehensive systematic review at this point, you would want to keep all of these articles and you'll work with them later. You'll decide which ones am I keeping, which ones am I using, and you can do that through the share option. Every single database has an option to share the entire results list. So you can share the URL so you can come back to it later. But what I would really recommend is using that citation management tool that I mentioned earlier, Mendeley or Zotero, because you can export all of the citations themselves with all the PDFs into the tool and then kind of finagle them and move them around later. And you would do that through exporting the results. And depending on the tool you're using, you're probably going to want it to be an RIS file. So just know, under Share, you have that option to send the entire list of your results into a citation management tool. And it does things like getting rid of duplicates for you. So it really makes your job easier along the way. The other thing to point out is that right now, this limit is for MU collections. Most databases, you won't run into this, but if you are searching this homepage search, the default is MU collections. So it's not comprehensive because you're not looking at stuff that MU doesn't have. It does mean you have everything that we see here. Mine's got a broken link image right now. Usually this looks like a brown find it at MU button. And if you click that, it's either going to direct you right to the article, or sometimes, we'll see if this one gives me an issue. Sometimes it directs right to the article, and that's what this one is going to do. It'll take me a second. But sometimes you get a broken page error, and then you just want to use this bar across the top that says open in a new window. It's an extra click, but you still have access. So sometimes we see people get frustrated just because it's a weird way to do it, but just one extra click and you've got access there. Okay, I'm not going to talk much more about searching just because, again, we want to get into a lot of other aspects of writing reviews, but this is kind of how you would create a search string. And once you've found what works, the first thing you try might not work, but once you've found what works, then you want to keep track of it. And you can do that through your search history, and it's going to pull up a list of all those terms of use. So then you can copy and paste them into other places and make sure that you're keeping the exact same format. Okay, I think Christy, you're saying there's a question.
Yes, question. So when you were deciding the range there, it looked like you chose 5 years, and there was a question in the chat, is 5 or 10 years better as a range, or what's your system for choosing the range there?
That depends really on your research. So depending on the field, a lot of science fields, things like psychology, might be much shorter because we get new terminology and things change and update every time there's a new DSM. But if you're trying to say, well, I'm comparing educational standards from the 1980s to the 2020 and looking at this 50-year range, you might have a wider base. So it really depends on your research project.
That makes sense why you chose the shorter window, because it's coronavirus, which is a newish thing, right?
Right. There wouldn't have been much written about it before 2019.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to leave this up for now, but I'm going to move on to a couple different pieces. I mentioned citation management tools, and we're going to come back to that in a second. But another thing that's really useful to know about are assessment tools for articles. This is becoming a more common requirement if you are submitting a systematic review or submitting a meta-analysis or a literature review, or if you're doing it for grant work. So these are good to know for grants as well. But when you choose articles, you have to prove that they're quality articles, that you didn't just find something out there and decide to include it, but really it's not a rigorous academic study. So you have to say, oh, I did go through, did quality assurance check, and here's the tool that I used. So I have a list here. If you email me after the session, I'm happy to share this list with you. These are some of the more common ones that I've come across. The most commonly used is Prisma. And Prisma has both the checklist and also a nice flow chart. Whenever you're doing that methodology section, typically there's a flow chart that goes along with it. And really, if you just Google Prisma flow chart, you'll find, or flow diagram, it could be called either, you'll find lots and lots of images of what this looks like. They're all pretty identical. You just say, oh, I found these many results. This many were duplicates. So now I have a smaller number. And then I got rid of this many because they didn't fit my topic. And now I have this even smaller number. So it's really just a flow chart that goes through and shows the process. So Prisma does that, CASP does that, and there's some others here as well, but the ones at the top are really the most common ones. You just do see some of these others occasionally as well in different fields. So it's good to kind of pick one of these at the beginning, just so you know before you even start your writing process, here's kind of the structure that I'm going to be looking at and looking for. And I do have, if anyone's interested again with that, I can show you an example. This is a publication I had recently that has a different flow chart in it as well. So if I just scroll down, you can kind of see what one of those flow charts looks like. This was a very intensive one. And what the methodology section might look like and how that quality criteria kind of fits in. So if you're interested in that piece, let me know. I'm happy to share that with you. The last thing I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen here and go ahead and share Mendeley really quickly, just so you can kind of see what this looks like. This is that citation management tool that I talked about. The paper I just showed you is the systematic review one, which was about incarceration and mental health interventions, specifically for juvenile populations. So this first group of articles, the top level, you can kind of see down at the bottom, this had 1,082 articles. That's really common. When you're trying to be comprehensive, you're going to find 1,000 to 2,000 articles, maybe only 500 if you're lucky, but you're going to get a huge number, and then you work it down to a much more manageable amount to work with. And you can see that I have a number of different folders here. There's the ones that I actually decided to use, but then there's also things that we got rid of because it was just a background article. There wasn't an intervention used. So one of our criteria was it had to talk about a mental health intervention, or it was a duplicate, or it wasn't in the United States. So you can kind of see we filed all of these away. And then when we go to write up our methodology, we can say like, oh, we didn't use down here at the bottom 305 of these because they weren't from the United States. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and pass this over to Christy. I do want to really quickly state that if you're here for the STAR program, now's a good time to mention this. You do get credit for being here, and let me know, send me a direct message in the chat, and I'm going to write down your name so that you get credit for being here for the STAR program.
Perfect. Thank you for wasting some time there while I was trying to figure out which screen I was sharing. Appreciate it. So I'm always blown away by Kimberly's tricks, and I learn something new from her every time. So if that was really a lot of information fast, if it was brand new for you as it is for me, I put the recorded version of a previous workshop in the chat. So feel free to review this again. But I want to talk a little bit about the writing portion. So you've done all the tricks that Kimberly suggested. You have a great set of articles. You've started to read them and you're like, wow, this is a lot, right? Like, how do I even start this project? And so I wanted to bring to you this piece by Joseph Harris. I read this book a couple years ago, and I was just really taken aback by the way that he sees the act of academic reading. And so I know normally we like try to find the main idea of an article, right? We skim an article, we try to find the main idea and we capture that and move on. But Harris suggests that instead of really hunting and pecking for facts and for main ideas, that we try to figure out how the particular piece of work that we're reading fits into a project. And he defines a project as something far more complex than a main idea. It doesn't refer to a single concept, but to a plan of work. And this is the language I really like, to a set of ideas and questions that a writer throws forward. So I like to think about these ideas and questions that are being thrown forward so that I have lots of ability to take the literature direction whatever way it goes and not be locked into that. Of course, we also know that reading is not a transparent act. Everyone does not read the same way. We bring our backgrounds, our experiences, and our knowledge base to what we read. And so many times we can read the same piece of work, even an academic article, multiple times and get different things from it each time, right? So just realizing that rereading is great and understanding that there's no one sort of one size fits all way of reading is the first part that I wanted to discuss. So Peg Boyle-Single is one of my favorite writers right now. The book that she wrote is called Demystifying Dissertation Writing. If you are one of our humanities colleagues here in the workshop today, I think you would find her book super useful. It's really written for a humanities graduate student or person who is who's managing graduate students. But I really like her interactive reading protocol, and it's one that I have taken up and used and my students find useful and have taken up and used. So here's what she says. She says that when you pre-read an article, especially a really dense peer-reviewed article or a book chapter, you want to pre-read this with a pencil in your hand. And that first quick skim through is really focusing on the big picture, right? You might look at the abstract, you might look at the subheadings, maybe read a few of the conclusions and mark a few things. She says it's really important to not use a highlighter in this. And that's because we know that highlighters, while they make very pretty colors, they can be very useful, they are a passive way of interacting with reading. So when you're highlighting, you're literally thinking, oh, I'm highlighting, oh, went too far, right? Like there's no like meaning making happening with that. So the way that we make meaning is by creating language with a pencil or a pen on the text. So she says, quickly read the whole article before taking notes. She has a great story in there about how she's spent many hours reading articles that ended up not being useful, and you have all these notes on them and you feel like you should use them, right? So to avoid that time sucking endeavor, read it first, make sure it's useful. And then the goal of reading in detail is really engaging in a conversation with the author. So asking those questions of what are the main points? What questions are they exploring? What theories are they exploring? And then finally, when I'm teaching students how to read academic articles, I also tell them read for content, of course, that's important, but also read for style. So every discipline writes in a different style, and part of the allure of a discipline is the way that they use language, right? So engineers might use the verb show, where philosophers will use the word think, and biologists might describe, right? You'll never see an engineering document use the word think, right? That's just not something they do. It's a precise design oriented sort of discipline. So as you're reading, see what kind of words are being used as well. That'll become really useful for writing the lit review later. Here's some more tips. She has an interactive reading process that's very structured, and I think it's great to start with the structure and then adjust it for whatever works for you and for your discipline. So she says when you're reading a chapter or an article, you want to use one set of 3 asterisks, so 3 stars, to denote the main argument or the main project or the main finding. That is really important because that's the one thing you want to remember about that article, right? So one set of 3 stars. Then she has other suggestions using H for hypotheses, if that works in your discipline. My discipline, I'm a social scientist, so theory is really important. So I often use this TH to denote the theory that they're working with. I really like her suggestion of when you're trying to find or to mark a useful quotation, do 2 things. First of all, underline it, but then write something with it. She suggests putting a Q next to it. That way, when you're flipping back through that article later, you'll be like, oh, right, I underlined that because that's a great quote. Otherwise, I'm often like, why did I underline? What's the point of this, right? So really making sure you're making notes of why you underlined or highlighted something. And then, of course, the really important thing is put question marks by things that you're unsure about or that need follow-up, because that can become a really important part of contributing to that gap, right, that we're trying to define through our literature reviews. So again, that's from a book. I will give you the citation here shortly, and I believe that's one that's in the library. I think Kimberly had all of those taken care of for us. So I'll show you those shortly. So after you read everything, then the challenge is like, how do I organize this? I remember my first literature review, I had stacks of papers and books and notes everywhere, and I didn't know what to do next, right? Here is my suggestion. I suggest that we reject the idea of an outline. While useful, an outline doesn't help us organize information. It kind of helps us present information. We need something that will help us organize information. And so I think concept maps are the way to go. It took me getting a PhD to realize that I don't think in this linear fashion, right? My brain's like this all the time. That's what's so fun about academic work. So if you're trying to take this messy academic work and shove it into an outline, you get really, really frustrated. So instead, I like to use concept maps. Concept maps allow writers to translate really difficult text into their own words because you're forced to paraphrase, which is a really important academic act. Concept maps also help us make those main ideas clear, and we can see how those main ideas connect to each other. That's what's so difficult, especially for emerging academics, is I have all this information and it all seems separate. How do I get it together in some sort of cohesive way? By the way, I see the question in the chat and I have an answer to it. It's coming, so stand by. Finally, the cool thing about concept maps is that it highlights disciplinary jargon. So it lets you see those verbs. It lets you see what kind of vocabulary is important, and you're able to start using that in your own speech. So here are a few ways that I have used concept maps. This, you can't read it. Doesn't matter if you can't read it. This hangs on the wall of my office back when I was on campus, you know, when the rest of us were as well. And this really helped me organize a lot of reading for my comps. So if you could see this hanging on the wall, you'd be able to read it. And you'll see that there's lots of little tiny articles and little tiny authors, but they're all grouped together by like things. And there's all these lines connecting them, and there's things written on the connections. For me, once I started reading all these things, I wanted to see how they fit together. And so this giant piece of paper on my office wall is super useful. And I still kept it because I'm proud of all those things I read. Here's my suggestion. I think is maybe, I'm not going to destroy your name. I'm going to say the person who has a question in the chat about how to deal with digital or soft copy articles. So I read digital articles on my iPad, and I have a whole method with that. I have an Apple Pencil, and it's been life-changing. I only recently got it. But I think that Post-it notes work if you're going to check out a book from the library, because we don't write in library books, right? We have librarians here, so we can't do that. I like to use Post-it notes both on articles that I can't physically write on and on books, because it forces me to put my ideas in those little tiny Post-it notes. I buy those ones that are like the 2-inch squares. That's what these are right here. And I read and I put them in the book as I'm reading. And then at the very end of my reading process, I pull them all out and I literally sort of manipulate them into making a concept map. So in this left-hand picture, the different color Post-it notes denote different sources. The pink ones came from one book, the teal ones came from another book, and this one lone dark blue one came from a third book. And so that helps me sort of do two things. First of all, it lets me know where to find that citation, because if you don't keep track of the citation, you will never find it again. Trust me on this one. And secondly, it lets me see if I'm using citation, if I'm using all of my sources. What I can see by looking at this is that I have maybe too much of the green source and not enough of the blue source. It's kind of heavy on one source. That helps me kind of keep track of that. So I recommend some sort of digital annotation tool, whether it's on your laptop or on a tablet, or Post-it notes in an old school way. I also use concept maps to carry out revisions. So this is a chapter of my dissertation, and when I was writing that a couple years ago now, and I took the actual physical comments from my advisor, I cut them up, I pasted them, and I added notes around there, right? So by freeing myself from thinking I have to do all this on the computer where it gets overwhelming, concept maps are really helpful. Okay, so that's my soapbox about concept maps. I love them and I use them all the time. This is a concept map from one of my actual students where she was trying to start learning about what critical literacy was. And as you can see, it kind of grows, right? She's asking questions, she's making connections. She's really in the idea gathering process here. So they can really help with note taking when you've read quite a few sources. Here are my best practices for concept maps. I like to use old school chart paper and Post-it notes and markers, but you can use whatever you want. I'll show you a cool computer program here in a second that's free you can use. In my world, these concept maps take the place of outlines. So I write directly from a concept map. Sorry, ignore my dog if you can hear, the garage door just went up. I don't go from concept map to outline to writing, but you could. I just don't need to do that anymore. The great thing about concept maps is that ideas are grouped by theme. So you can see that there's themes here, questioning power structures, not just social justice, right? They naturally help us create those themes. And they naturally help us make connections. In fact, sometimes I force my students to write on these lines to like articulate what the connection is. And of course, make sure you include citations, because again, you'll never find it again. Has anyone, you can put in the chat if you have, has anyone used Jamboard through Google? It is my new absolute favorite thing for teaching and for my own research. This is a picture of what it looks like. So Jamboard is free, just like Google Docs are, Google Drive. It's literally, and I'll show you here, it's jamboard.google.com. But it lets you create Post-it notes electronically. And so you can see that these, you can stretch them, you can move them, you can change colors, you can add pictures. So my students are actually writing a response from some reading using Jamboard. I'm trying to like force them to do this. And this is the sample that I gave them. It can be done collaboratively if you have multiple authors, but this is to date, for me, the best online concept mapping program. All right, enough about concept maps. I have you on board now, I think, right? So we've read everything, we've organized, and it's time to write. There are 3 ways that you can organize a literature review. Notice that none of these ways says that you organize it by article, right? We sometimes see that with emerging academics where they have this article says this, and this article says that, and this article says something else. The real key of a literature review is to bring those conversations together in some meaningful organizational structure. So the 3 ways that I like best are chronological. So if we're thinking about a topic like the coronavirus, maybe it would be very useful, depending on our research question, to trace the chronological development, because a lot of things change as we learn more, right? So that's tracing development through time. Perhaps though, it might be more useful for me to look at by trend, right? So like this was the trend early in coronavirus, and then this trend happened later. So looking at trends as sort of like these pivot points. But in all disciplines and for all topics, the thematic version is the most appropriate, most preferred, I guess is the right word, way to organize things. So that's where you would have a subheading that has a theme, and then underneath there you will have simulated many different articles, chapters, citations, etc., to sort of show the trends and the big ideas throughout the literature. The theme is really a great way to organize it because that lets you nicely sort of funnel down into, and this is the gap that I'm trying to cover. I like these organizing graphics because it helps me think about, well, what are different ways that I could think about theme, right? So sometimes I could think about themes as describing and defining. So these different themes I might describe and define within. Sometimes I like to compare and contrast within themes or across themes. So you can see where one thing sort of is connecting to another idea or topic. And then most often I like to analyze and then synthesize. So um, when we read a lot of articles, we're analyzing, which is a deep dive, a close reading into an article, and then we have to pull back out and synthesize all those ideas together. So just some ways to think about, how do I synthesize rather than just summarize what I'm reading? These are the three books that I like the best. I think none of them are perfect. I'm now realizing that the that the Peg Smith Boyle book isn't on there. I'll add that to the chat when I get done talking here. But I like these three books the best for thinking about effective literature review writing. Paul Sylvia's book is great. He's a social scientist. He's hilarious to read. And he takes you through in this book the different phases of writing and through the different types of writing. So he'll teach you how to write an introduction, a method section, a lit review, etc. His earlier book you may have heard of is called How to Write a Lot. And that's a really great book for practices to get you to be a really productive academic writer. The second two come out of the UK. Apparently that's where all the work on writing literature reviews and theses and dissertations is coming from. I have no idea why, but I really like these two books because they have some practical strategies that work across all disciplines. And I'll put the other one in the chat here shortly. Kimberly, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, so I know we've got a little bit of time left, and that gives us time to do plugs for a couple of different resources that you have access to, and also some of the new tools that our campus is starting to support that I'm really excited about. So the pictures here we have on the left is Ellis Library. Obviously, I'm not in the library right now, but the library is open. We kind of rotate who goes in the building, so you can still get help that way. We also are manning our chat service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you do your best writing at 2 a.m., you can hop online and talk to a librarian. It will not always be me at 2 a.m. In fact, it's almost never me at 2 a.m. But you have the option of asking and also finding out who your specific subject librarian is. We work an awful lot with faculty members and with graduate students who are writing systematic reviews and literature reviews and dissertations. So if you're just getting started, it's a really good idea to figure out who your subject librarian is. There's a list on our contact page of who works with which disciplines, and set up a consultation. We'll do that on Zoom, and we can kind of work through setting up that search string that we talked about and getting you started. So the libraries and your librarians are a really good resource to have. That middle picture is the Campus Writing Center. This is geared toward helping with writing as well, specifically more toward undergraduate writing. And they like to say that they will help with your paper, they won't write it for you, but they do assist with those theme ideas. So if you kind of have an idea and you've got a lot of research done and you're trying to figure out how to consolidate it, or if you've put something together and you're just not thinking it flows well, the Writing Center is a really good resource for that. On the far right there is, do you want to talk about that one, Christy?
Sure, I will. That's my home when we can all get back to campus. That is the Conley House. It's an old Italian Renaissance, I believe is the architectural style, house on the corner of 6th and Conley, and it houses the campus writing program. So again, we are different from the Writing Center. We love them. We work closely with them, but we really support faculty and graduate students in thinking about how to teach with writing. So that's where our houses, that's where we're housed. We also have writing retreats back when we can be in rooms together. And once again, we will be able to be in rooms together. So These writing retreats are a space where you can come and enjoy this beautiful old house and have a quiet, protected time to write. So watch our website, which I will put in the chat right now for when those resume again someday.
And Shayla, I'm sorry if I say your name wrong, but Shayla mentioned in the chat sometimes that it's hard to write in English when English is not your first language. That is absolutely true. And the campus writing program can help with some of, or I'm sorry, Campus Writing Center can help with some of that as well. They won't go through and edit and like line edit your paper, but they can talk about specific grammar things. Like they'll go through it and read it and say like, okay, well, here's something that you're consistently doing well. And here's something that consistently maybe we would want to change and want to shift. So, and Michelle says it's difficult even if it is your first language. That's true too. I do want to point out that if you are looking to publish, the libraries also help with that regard. We can help you find a home for any publication that you're writing and talk about different journals. And I know that there is a concern with predatory journals that are out there, especially when we talk about open access. That would be an entirely different workshop, so I'm not going to dive into that too much. But if you're looking, if you've written, or if you're in the process of writing an article, and you also think it would be a good publication, or you're writing it to be published, we can help with looking into different journals and finding it a home. The last image here is from MoSpace, and MoSpace is the University of Missouri's repository. What that means is it's the home for things that are published at the University of Missouri. So dissertations are automatically put in MoSpace, and theses are as well. So if you're writing a dissertation or thesis, this is a really good tool for you to look at because you can see the dissertations that people in your department have successfully defended before. So you can, like Christy mentioned, take a look at what the reporting verbs are, what that structure looks like, what's expected in terms of formatting, and just have examples of successfully defended dissertations. It's also a really great place, even if you're not a graduate student doing a dissertation, to put any publication that you have. We have librarians that work with copyright. And so if you are publishing and you want your articles to be open access and to be free, because then they get more citations and that goes towards tenure and promotion, MoSpace is the place that we can do that with. It makes the copy that's available on Google Scholar free, and we can negotiate the copyright for you and with you, but really for you with the journal so that you still retain the copyright and the journal doesn't own it. So definitely talk with our librarians if you're looking into publishing, or if you've already published something, we can still work with that. Usually there's an embargo period, but we can put a free copy up after a year or so, depending on the journal. So if you've published something and you want it to be freely available so your citations go up, let me know, or let the libraries know. You can go to that Contact Us page. So super useful. The last thing I want to talk about is I'm going to share my screen again. This will stop other screen sharing, so I hope that's okay, Christy, before I steal control over. I'm going to go show my screen one more time. We have a new tool that the libraries and the campus writing program are kind of partnering together on that's called Power Notes. And I meant to talk about this earlier and I forgot, so I'm going to throw it in now. But Power Notes is it's a browser extension. So you can kind of see it. I just turned it on for me, so you didn't see it earlier, but it's that yellow P up at the top. And now I have this yellow circle P at the bottom right-hand corner of my screen as well. So now when I am in an article or on a website, if I highlight something, I get this drop-down list. And it's like, oh, do you want to save this to Power Notes? And I might say, yes, I do. I think this should go with my, category. And I can make a note and be like, ooh, compare this to John Smith, I don't know, or Jane Doe or someone. This little citation thing here is going to grab the details. It's not a perfect citation, so it doesn't replace using a citation management tool, but it does let you know where you took the quote from, which is really nice. So you can go back and find it again. And then it shows up in Power Notes. So that shows up as a sidebar now. I really like this tool because as you're reading an article, you can engage with the text, kind of like Christy mentioned. It does form things into a little bit of an outline, so it's not perfect that way. But once you've finished reading the text or multiple texts, then you can come into the Power Notes website and go in, and everything's kind of set up like it's an index card. So you can shuffle these index cards around and say like, oh, well, I'm going to drag this down here because I think this part actually fits better down here. And you can add in transition sentences. Again, more outline format. So maybe not how you want to go about creating and generating themes. What I really like this for is a systematic review application, because you can export this into a Word document, but you can also export it into an Excel file. And if you've ever looked at a systematic review or a meta-analysis, and I'll pull mine up again just as an example here, there's always a table. Mine's down at the bottom where it has like, here are all the articles we listed. And then here's all their demographic information. And here's all the interventions that were used, because they all use different ones. So how are we comparing them? And here's the outcomes. So every systematic review has one of these tables. And you can, with Power Notes, have the heading be that top line of your table. And then just have, as you're going through the article, be like, demographic information, send that into my table. This is the demographic information for this article and the demographic information for that article. So as you're reading through it the first time, you're grabbing all of that stuff for your chart, and then you just export it into the Excel file. So when I found this out, I was really excited about this tool, but it also is a really good way, I'll stop sharing, for your students to engage with the text as they're reading it. So as they're reading, they can highlight, they can make notes, they can ask questions. So like Christy said, initially when you're going through with a pencil, if it's a digital format, Power Notes is the way to do that. As you're going through the text, you can talk and you can ask questions and make notes for yourself so that later when you come back to it, you still have all of that together. Okay.
And on that note, Kimberly, while you're reading the chat, continue to watch our website, the events website that I put in there for Campus Writing Program, because Kimberly and I have plans for Power Notes workshop once we get it approved later down the road. So check back there. And there were 2 Mendeley questions in there, Kimberly. I don't know if we want to like officially close, and then if you have a chance to answer those, that would be great, or whatever you are available to do.
Yes, and I will answer both of those. I do want to say one last thing about Power Notes. It's not fully operational yet. So we just are starting to work with this. IT is confirming it as of this week. And so you can use it on websites and you can use it on a lot of different locations, but it won't yet work in library PDFs. That's going to be the next step. And hopefully we'll get that up and running next week. But whenever IT gives us the go ahead, that will start up. So, and Christy says in the chat, send her any Power Notes questions. Yeah, so no, this is a cool new thing that we're kind of soft launching right now, but it's not fully operational yet this week. So if you look at it, it's free. You would just sign up with your MU email, but it will become fully operational hopefully soon. So really new, really exciting stuff. We're excited because it's like shiny new toys for academics and research. All right, so yes, questions in the chat about Mendeley. The one I see right now is, can we pull info from Mendeley to Excel? And I think someone else asked if I could demonstrate how you get the information from the search into Mendeley. So I will share my screen again and pull that back up. So initially we ran this search, right? I'm gonna hope my screen didn't time out. It may have, sometimes it does that. So if I collapse my search history, we'll see. It might send me home. It did. Okay, that's okay. We're just gonna do a really quick example search and not actually do much with it. So my go-to example is chocolate and health, because I like justifying eating a lot of chocolate. And letting that load. And it's gonna want me to log in, which I have to do to be able to export. So I'm gonna do that really quickly. You can send entire search results, or you can send individual articles into Mendeley, and it works the same way. Either way, you're either going to share the entire thing, that share dropdown list, and this works in every database. Again, I'm using the gray search box, which is not a database, but it works the same way wherever you are. You're looking for the option to export results. Sometimes that's under a dropdown list that says share. Sometimes it's just at the top of the page, but you want that export option. I should turn off Power Notes because now every time I highlight anything, it's like, do you want to send this to your document? Not at the moment, thank you. So you want to email that link, and when you click email, it's going to ask what format you want it. RIS is the version that you want, because you don't just want the citations, right? You want the data. The data is what goes into Mendeley or into the Zotero, whichever one you prefer to use. And you're going to email that to your actual email address, and it's going to show up as a zip drive. Now you can either open that zip drive, and if you only have one citation management tool, it's going to open in the correct one. If you're like me and you play around with a bunch of different citation management tools to see what works best for which project, you want to go into Zotero or Mendeley and then open that zip drive once you're already in the tool. But again, this is going to send the zip drive to you as an email, and it'll be an attachment in an email. So that's how you would go about getting it and getting it into Mendeley. The other question, I think it had to do with Excel, right? Can you pull information from Mendeley into Excel? Yes and no. You can, like any document, copy and paste text. Mendeley has the option of adding PDFs. So you can just have the citations in Mendeley, or you can have the full PDF. So if I stop sharing this screen, let's see if I can pull up an example for that. Mendeley. So should go to the ones that we actually wound up using in incarceration final papers. So here there's the download option. I could download this. There's my article for this particular one, and I can take notes. So in Mendeley, you can take notes and you can do things like that, but I can also copy and paste things over into Excel. It doesn't export directly into Excel. You can export the bibliography list from Mendeley into Excel because that's just the plugin that you would still have in Word or Excel. And we do have workshops on using Mendeley. Most of the time they're in person because obviously, it's a little easier to demonstrate when you have the option of doing it. So we do it in a computer lab where you're being shown how to do it, but you also have the option of bringing your own laptop and doing it as we walk through so that once you've gone through the workshop, you've already had it all set up. But there is hold on, I should share my screen again. I'm getting ahead of myself. There is a guide on our website that will walk you through this process. So if you're on the library's homepage, there's a little search bar at the very top right of the page that I think it's overlooked, and it doesn't look for articles or books or any library stuff like that. It looks for sites that librarians have created. So if you look for Mendeley here, you're going to come across the guide that we've developed that walks you through Mendeley as a whole. So there's going to be short videos on here's how you download it and here's how you use it for X, Y, and Z. So you can find a little bit more detail about how to export and move citations around and do all of those details through the site. That looks like a broken, oh, it is a broken video. That's terrible. Okay, I need to fix that. Interesting. But yeah, this website should walk you through how to install it, how to get it, and then how to use it and export citations into different Microsoft products. All right, any other questions? I think that's it. Okay, well, I'm happy to stick around if anyone else has things that they want to ask. But otherwise, I'm going to throw my email into the chat box as well. I know Christy already did that. And please feel free to contact us at any point. You can send me an email or you can schedule a meeting on Zoom. I mentioned if you're writing a systematic review meeting with your librarian, you can send us an email, or you can also look in MU Connect and your librarian should be listed there just like your advisor is. And again, if you're an undergrad and you're here for the STAR program, let me know. Send me that in the chat or turn on your microphone and let me know so that I actually write it down and give you credit.